Hey, have you heard the news? Pro wrestling is dead. I'm Mike Quackenbush, this is Till We Make It, and today I wish to tackle a topic here on the channel that I have heard intoned recently in more than one place, and that is the offhanded remark that pro wrestling is dead, which I happen to think is an absurd notion. Why do people say this? Well, I happen to think there are a few chief reasons, and I want to break those down and detail them for you now. So the first, and I think the easiest of these reasons to wrap your brain around, is this. The people that say pro wrestling is dead have had their emotional attachment to the characters severed. And that can happen for a number of reasons, but among the chief reasons, this. The performers they grew up watching, and the performers that first captured their imagination in the world of wrestling, are either retired now or sadly deceased. They are just not part of the wrestling landscape whatsoever. They formed an emotional attachment to those performers are gone, and so their emotional attachment is severed. And this makes them feel like pro wrestling is dead. A second possible reason is because their preferred means of interacting with the world of wrestling have come to an end. So when I was growing up, I used to watch professional wrestling Saturday morning, right after all the Saturday morning cartoons were over. That's when the World Wrestling Federation came on my TV. Could I watch the World Wrestling Federation on Saturday mornings right after all my cartoons? Not anymore. No, I couldn't. I've got some VHS tapes, which might help me to recreate that experience, but can I do it with the content being made this year, right now? No, I can't. And as someone who had a very specific means by which they interacted with the world of wrestling and have seen that come to an end, might feel as if their experience is no longer what it once was. And the way in which that is expressed is when they say, well, wrestling is dead, when that really isn't the case. What has changed is the means by which they interact with the world of professional wrestling. A third possible reason someone might say wrestling is dead is because the state of the art has evolved to a point where they can no longer recognize what professional wrestling has evolved into. And one of many ways we could explore this topic is just to look at pro wrestling as a physical language, the physicality of professional wrestling. So I'm not talking about the technological parts, I'm not talking about the performative parts, I'm talking simply about the physical language. And I'll give you an example so we're on the same page. When I first started watching professional wrestling, a super kick wasn't even called a super kick, it was called a savate kick. It was named for a mysterious martial art, savate. And maybe, if you were lucky, you saw 2 a year. Now, you see about 12 per match. The state of the art in professional wrestling has evolved and changed. And to someone who would find that very jarring, they might react by saying, pro wrestling is dead because they no longer recognize it as the thing they first identified as professional wrestling. They believe whatever that was no longer exists, and this other thing isn't professional wrestling, and therefore, the thing they grew up with is gone. It's dead. I can think of at least one more reason why someone might say pro wrestling is dead. And I feel like I've heard this as much inside the industry from fellow performers or behind the scenes people as I have from outside the industry from critics or customers, etc. And that is because to them, pro wrestling no longer feels the way that it used to. And I guess if we want to put a fine point on it, at least referencing this audience, not so much this one, it is because the culture around wrestling has changed so dramatically over the years that it no longer resembles the pro wrestling they came into. So thinking about people, especially those who came in a solid 2 or 3 generations before me. So I start my journey in 1994. People that start out in the 1980s had a very different experience in professional wrestling. And the culture around wrestling featured certain things and certain extracurricular activities that just aren't part of pro wrestling. They just aren't. That stuff is, by and large, gone. Is it entirely gone? No, of course not. But by and large, that old 80s wrestling culture is gone. And if that felt like wrestling to someone, and that was totally gone now, they might feel like, to them, pro wrestling is dead. But I think a lot of those elements and ingredients that made the pro wrestling culture of decades past, having been pushed out, represents positive change for professional wrestling. There are so many horror stories about what happens to those performers because of the lifestyle choices they made back then. I would like to believe we're all making smarter choices. We're making healthier choices. We're going to do the kinds of things that don't mean we are dying in droves, decades ahead of the curve of other professional athletes and performers. That some of those more destructive and narrow-minded tendencies are being eradicated for the good of professional wrestling. I know how easy it is when someone is expressing their cynical opinion or even a bit of outrage about the world of professional wrestling to jump on that train. It does seem at times as if that is exactly the thing social media was built for. But looking past a little bit of that cynicism, taking an honest look at where professional wrestling is today versus where it's been in decades past, I think pro wrestling has never been more vibrant. There are all these weird, wonderful flavors of professional wrestling more readily available through more platforms than ever before, all waiting to be sampled by you. And just to be clear, to those people out there that feel like the pro wrestling they're watching now is not the pro wrestling they grew up with, hey, you're right. I want to validate what you're saying. And I feel the same way. The wrestling I watch right now is not the wrestling that I grew up with. And that doesn't mean that pro wrestling is dead. In fact, I think pro wrestling has never been better, even though it may no longer resemble the thing we fell in love with during our childhood, or the stories or characters that captured our imaginations when we were young. Like any other art form out there, pro wrestling must evolve or die. And if this art form has evolved to the point that you no longer have any attachment to it and can derive no enjoyment from it, there's probably another art form waiting out there for you to discover. The world is full of them, and you need not dedicate any more of your time or attention, especially to something that isn't rewarding for you. If you happen to be looking for something that might reinvigorate your appetite for professional wrestling, I'm going to link to a video we made a little while ago that might help offer some alternatives so that you can put something fresh into your diet and discover a new way of enjoying pro wrestling. And if for any reason that's not enough to shake you out of your funk, well, I want you to know you can leave all of your cynicism and all of your outrage down below in the comments. YouTube doesn't care. They treat all those things the same in their algorithm. It looks like engagement to YouTube. They love it. So go ahead, fill up the comments. We can always go through later and delete them.